All right, diving right in this week. And guys, you requested this one, the Christina Jaksimovic case. Tragic, really complex. And, she had the seemingly picture-perfect life, right? Former Miss Switzerland finalist, catwalk coach. At least that's what her social media showed.
Yeah, and that's often where these cases get really interesting, isn't it? Peeling back those layers, the headlines, the online persona. We're going beyond all that to figure out what really happened.
Exactly. And we've got a lot to unpack. We're diving deep into articles from the Indian Express, Daily Mail, People magazine, trying to understand what could drive someone to do something this horrific.
Right, and it's not just about what happened, it's about the why, the psychology behind it all, the forensic evidence. Speaking of, that Daily Mail autopsy report, it's going to be a tough one to stomach, folks, gives us a glimpse into a level of violence that, well, it's chilling, to say the least.
Let's start at the beginning. February 13th of this year, Christina is found dead in her home in Switzerland. Initial reports, like the one from the Indian Express, say her husband, Thomas, confessed, seems open and shut, right?
Not so fast.
Oh.
The Daily Mail paints a much more, shall we say, unsettling picture. It wasn't just a murder itself, it's how he tried to cover it up. Dismemberment, a jigsaw, garden shears, even used an industrial blender. That's next level.
It's like he wasn't just trying to hide a body, he was trying to, I don't know, erase her existence.
Exactly. And that's where things get really interesting, psychologically speaking. What does that tell us about his state of mind?
Especially with that Daily Mail autopsy report. They mention he specifically removed Christina's womb. I mean, that's not just hiding a body. That feels so much more deliberate, personal.
Absolutely. That detail right there, it screams deeper psychological motivation. This wasn't a random act, a crime of passion. This was calculated. There's a level of, dare I say, rage, a need for control, maybe even a twisted sense of possessiveness. It's disturbing, to say the least.
And that ties into something else People magazine brought up. They cited a report from The Telegraph, I believe, that investigators observed, and I quote, sadistic sociopathic traits in Thomas, not to mention a chilling lack of empathy and cold-bloodedness after killing his wife.
Okay, so terms like sadistic, sociopathic, we got to be careful throwing those around, right? The media loves a good label. But clinically speaking, they point to some very specific, let's be honest, disturbing personality characteristics. A lack of remorse, a complete disregard for social norms, a capacity for cruelty. It's not your average person we're talking about here.
So it's not just the act itself, but the apparent lack of remorse or guilt afterward.
Precisely. And that's where it gets really tricky, right? Because now we're trying to square this image of a seemingly ordinary guy living a normal life with this ability for such brutality.
And the contrast is even more jarring when you factor in his initial claims to the police.
Right. Several sources say he claimed Christina attacked him with a knife, trying to paint himself as the victim. But the autopsy. The Daily Mail goes into detail her injuries. Blunt force trauma, and get this, those injuries happened before she died.
So much for self-defense.
Exactly. This wasn't some spur-of-the-moment thing. This was a struggle, a far more violent encounter than he initially let on. And the fact that those injuries happened before her death, yeah, that points to premeditation.
God, it's chilling to think about.
It is, and it makes you realize how easily we can misjudge people and situations. This wasn't some random act of violence. This was calculated, brutal. And it's that level of premeditation, especially the way he mutilated her body, that just makes you wonder what else was going on beneath the surface of this seemingly normal life.
Which brings us to her online presence. I mean, it's almost impossible to reconcile the brutality of her murder with the picture-perfect life she seemed to portray online.
Right. Just weeks before her death, she posted about this romantic getaway with Thomas. They looked like the perfect couple.
Yeah.
So what's the truth? Was she masking unhappiness? Was she trying to project this image of a perfect marriage? Or was that a genuine reflection of her emotional state at the time?
It's wild, right? Like her Instagram versus the reality of what happened, it's hard to wrap your head around.
It is, and it speaks to this whole idea of like social media versus reality, We curate these versions of ourselves online, showing the good, hiding the bad. It's the highlight reel, not the behind the scenes.
And this case is like a crash course in that. The Daily Mail even pulled up some of her posts, specifically one about a romantic getaway, just weeks before her murder. They looked happy, carefree, totally in love.
See, and that's what makes it so complicated. Was she putting on a front, trying to project this image of a perfect marriage? Maybe to keep up appearances, maybe because of societal pressure.
Yeah.
Or was it genuine? Was she actually happy? which would make his actions even more baffling.
It makes you think, right? The pressure to present a certain image, especially for someone like her. I mean, former Miss Switzerland finalist, that's a lot of pressure to be perfect.
Exactly. And honestly, I think this case should make us all take a step back and look at our own relationship with social media. How often are we comparing ourselves to these curated, filtered versions of reality?
It's a good point. It's a good reminder that there's always more to the story than what we see online. But even with that in mind, it still doesn't explain what would drive someone to do something so horrific.
Nope. And that's where we got to circle back to those sadistic sociopathic traits the investigators mentioned. Now, it's important to remember, those traits alone don't equal violence right there.
Right.
But they do suggest a certain, let's say, predisposition, a lack of empathy, disregard for social norms, tendency towards manipulation. Yeah. When you combine that with other factors, well, it can be a recipe for disaster.
So, not saying we can diagnose anyone from afar, but those traits, plus the premeditation, the brutality, something was definitely not right.
Absolutely. And this is where understanding the nuances of human psychology, especially in the context of crime, becomes super important. It's not just black and white, good versus evil. There are so many layers: personality, history, situational factors.
And it sounds like mental illness might be one of those layers in this case. The Daily Mail mentioned the court documents specifically cited concrete indications of a mental illness in Thomas.
Right. And that just adds a whole other level of complexity. Now, again, we got to be careful. Mental illness does not equal violence. Full stop.
Of course.
In fact, people with mental health conditions are way more likely to be victims of violence, not perpetrators. But, and this is a big but, if someone's mental illness is untreated or undertreated, it can cloud their judgment, make them more impulsive, even exacerbate existing personality traits. And yeah, that can increase the risk of violence.
So we can't say for sure that his mental state directly caused this, but it's definitely something to consider.
Exactly. And it brings up this huge question. How does the justice system deal with that? How do you determine accountability when mental illness is a factor, especially in a case as horrific as this? How do you balance justice with understanding?
Big questions, no easy answers. So where does this all go from here? What's next in the legal process? So what happens now? Where does this case go from here?
Well, all the sources say Thomas is in custody, awaiting those formal charges. But there's this one detail, really interesting, they all keep mentioning. Apparently, he's refused to give investigators access to his phone.
His phone? Why?
Privacy concerns, he says.
Makes you wonder what's on there, right? And why he's so insistent on keeping it hidden.
It's like, think about it. Our phones are like our lifelines these days. Every little detail, every conversation, every dark thought, it's all right there.
A digital trail.
Exactly. So investigators, they're probably hoping to find, I don't know, evidence of premeditation, searches about dismemberment, how to, get rid of a body.
Or maybe even just like messages, conversations that could point to a motive. Or even accomplices.
Exactly. And it's not just the big stuff, right? GPS data, timestamps on photos, all that can help build a timeline.
And the fact that he's refusing access, it just makes it seem like he's hiding something big. Like whatever's on that phone could blow his whole defense.
It really does. And this just goes to show digital forensics, it's not just a fancy term, it's becoming essential. Our digital footprints are almost impossible to erase completely.
It's like a silent witness.
Right. Now, we can't say for sure what's on his phone, but the fact that it's such a sticking point, that tells you something. It tells you there's still pieces missing from this puzzle.
It's almost like the most important clues aren't even physical anymore, It's all in the digital world.
Exactly. So as this case moves forward, it'll be interesting to see what, if anything, comes out about that phone.
Definitely. This whole case, it's a lot to process. It reminds you that you can never really know what goes on behind closed doors or, behind someone's carefully curated online persona.
It's a tough lesson, right? Appearances can be deceiving.
Absolutely. So, to everyone listening, keep those critical thinking caps on, okay? Question everything, because there are always multiple sides to every story. What do you think was on that phone? What does this case say about justice, about mental health in this digital age? Keep those questions in mind, because the answers, well, they might surprise us all, and sometimes the truth is even more complex than we could ever imagine.